power collapses in many forms, but few are as grotesque as the death of King Philip II of Spain. For a ruler who once held sway over half the known world, his final adversary was not a rival sovereign or rebellious populace, but something far more insidious: the slow rot of his own body. As we walk the dim halls of the Escorial Palace during the summer of 1598, prepare for a tale in which supreme authority meets utter helplessness, where greatness decays into helpless flesh, and where nature pronounces its harshest judgment on royal arrogance. Philip II reigned as the most formidable monarch of his era, commanding the first truly global empire. His territories stretched from the Americas to the archipelago that still bears his name, the Philippines. As the heir of Emperor Charles V, Philip governed lands across vast oceans, embodying the famous declaration that in his dominions, the sun never set. As the staunch defender of Catholicism during the Counter-Reformation, he was both idolized and dreaded, dispatching his formidable armada against England and sponsoring brutal crusades against Protestant reformers throughout Europe. Yet despite all his worldly might, Philip's final war would not be fought on foreign soil, but in the confines of his own bed. For 52 relentless days under the scorching Spanish sun, the king, once the master of fleets and armies, was rendered immobile, imprisoned within his decaying flesh as minuscule organisms, invisible to the eye, who consumed him from the inside out. This is more than a narrative of physical agony, though the pain was extraordinary. It is a reflection on the fragility of power, the certainty of death, and the merciless equality of decay. The Escorial Palace, designed by Philip himself as both royal home and eternal resting place, would indeed become his gravenly after it bore witness to his slow and torturous decline. Inside its austere walls, a monarch who once shaped the destiny of nations found himself helpless in the face of relentless infection and parasitic invasion. Eyewitnesses to his final days recorded scenes so horrific that historians long dismissed them as embellishment. But today, modern medicine suggests otherwise. What follows is the documented account of Philip II's appalling end, so drawn out, grotesque, and humiliating that it endures as a memento mori of unmatched intensity. As we lift the embroidered royal linens to expose the decaying sovereign beneath, we are reminded that even the most exalted among us return to dust, sometimes inch by inch, sometimes still breathing, sometimes consumed by the lowest creatures of the earth. Signs of Philip's terminal decline first emerged in the spring of 1598. At 71, he was considered old for his time and had already endured decades of health struggles. Gout had afflicted him since his 30s, contorting his hands and feet into deformed, painful shapes that made everyday activities, like writing or walking, increasingly arduous. With each passing year, Philip's afflictions became more frequent and intense, creeping from his extremities to his knees, wrist, and shoulders. He also developed a particularly aggressive form of arthritis. Courtiers noted that he was rendered so immobile, he couldn't even lift a hand to scratch his scalp. Coupled with relentless fevers, these ailments had already confined the monarch to a wheelchair by 1591. Yet, despite his deteriorating body, he clung to his infamous diligence, personally examining all major state matters, and at times responding with a lone directive. Their number. That single word could alter the lives of thousands across his sprawling empire. Then, in June 1598, the king's condition sharply declined. A resurgence of fevers left him delirious and feeble. More troubling still, large boils began erupting on his right hand and knee. These abscesses would burst and drain, only to return more aggressively. His physicians, limited by the rudimentary understanding of medicine, at the time resorted to poultices and bloodletting. But the infection marched on, without mercy. In a matter of weeks, the once dominant ruler of Spain was bedridden, able to move only his head and left arm. The supreme sovereign of Christendom had become fully reliant on attendance for even the most basic bodily needs. His rigid Spanish court customs, which had once shaped the most ceremonious court in Europe, were powerless against the necessities of survival. The same man once approached with reverent bows now lay helplessly in his own waste when servants could not replace his bedding quickly enough. As the scorching heat of July bore down, so too did Philip's torment. The abscesses multiplied now, covering his chest, groin, and thighs. A rancid odor emanated from these weeping wounds, so foul that even his most loyal attendants struggled to stay in the room. The stench of decaying flesh wafted through the palace halls, forcing courtiers to hold perfumed cloths to their faces as they passed near his chamber. Philip, still mentally alert enough to grasp the horror of his state, ordered the windows shut not for relief, but to shield outsiders from the offensive odor. Eyewitnesses recorded that his body was riddled with pustules, which would erupt and refill with bloody, oozing fluid. These festering sores refused to heal, and instead became incubators for an even more terrifying enemy. Immobile and in constant pain, Philip's sweat-drenched bed linen turned into an ideal haven for infestation. The first lice were noticed in early August. Whether they came from a servant or arose from the moldering sheets, they quickly found in Philip's festering body a paradise warm, damp, and defenseless. The parasites bred at an alarming rate, feasting on the king's blood and the necrotic tissue that covered his body. Soon, accounts described lice blanketing him so completely that attendants could not keep up, no matter how diligently they tried to cleanse him. Diego Depez, the king's confessor, later claimed that the vermin didn't just crawl on Felipe, emerged from within his infected wounds, birthed by the decaying monarch himself. Whether this was factually accurate or simply appeared so to those watching in horror, the result was the same. The most powerful man in Europe had become a living nest of vermin. Some reports suggest that certain attendants were tasked exclusively with removing lice from the king's body, gathering them by the handful, only to see fresh swarms return within hours. Yet lice were only superficial tormentors. The real terror resided deeper inside Philip's collapsing frame. Court physician Andres Zamudio de Alfaro recorded that the monarch's wounds began to produce foul, decomposing matter where numerous maggots began to thrive. These larvae, likely the offspring of common flies that had slipped in through palace windows or doors, found fertile ground in the king's open, rotting sores and began feeding on his dying flesh. Picture the scene. A man once venerated as nearly godlike, whose touch was once thought to cure ailments like scrofula, now helplessly observing as worms writhed beneath his skin and crawled out from festering lesions. Each day his staff scraped away the maggots, only to discover new squirming colonies by the next morning. Philip, still conscious and increasingly turning to his Catholic devotion for solaces, said to have murmured, "Lord, How heavy these punishments seem to me. Yet, how light they must be compared to my sins. By late August, even more terrifying symptoms surfaced. The unrelenting pressure of lying motionless caused large bed sores to form, especially on his right hip and lower back. These wounds, worsened by his inability to move and the constant dampness of sweat-soaked bedding, eventually tore through layers of skin, fat, and muscle, laying bare the bone beneath. Chronicler C. Deator described one such ulcer on the king's hip as so massive, it exposed the inner cavity of his body. This monstrous lesion, said to be the size of a clenched hand, developed a revolting micro-ecosystem of its own. Friar José de Siganuza, who recorded the king's last days, noted that from this single wound, attendants extracted enough rotted material daily to fill 2 silver basins. More disturbingly, the festering sore became a prime breeding ground for maggots, which multiplied faster than they could be cleared away. Eyewitnesses recounted how the larvae would burrow deeper when disturbed, devouring the monarch from the inside out. The flies, drawn by the scent of decay, were not satisfied with laying eggs in necrotic tissue alone. As Philip's health declined further, they began to infest his facial orifices, mouth, ears, and nostrils. Incapable of brushing them away, the once dreaded ruler could only endure as bugs crawled across his face and disappeared inside. Some scholars suspect he developed myiasis, a gruesome condition in which fly larvae infest and feed on living tissue throughout the body. Worsening this grim tableau was the king's escalating gout, which made even the gentlest touch to his limbs unbearable. Yet, his frail body still needed to be turned and cleaned. Every time his aides attempted to shift his position or remove soiled linens, his screams of agony reverberated through the palace. The monarch, who had once looked on without emotion, as heretics perished in autos de fe, now pleaded for compassion from his own attendants. Throughout the ghastly ordeal, Philip's mind remained largely unaffected. This mental clarity may have been the cruelest curse of all. He was painfully aware of his own descent, from ruler to rotting flesh. The king, who had constructed the Grand Escorial as a monument to Spanish supremacy and his personal legacy, now lay decaying within its chambers. Fully conscious of every fresh humiliation inflicted upon his deteriorating body. In spite of his unbearable suffering, Philip showed remarkable resolve when it came to spiritual matters. He insisted that Mass be held daily in his quarters and frequently asked for sacred texts to be read aloud. The man who had enforced Catholic orthodoxy across the continent held fast to his faith, even as his physical form became a grotesque display of torment. When he could speak between waves of agony, he continued to engage in discussions about governance and the future of his empire with his son and designated successor, the future Philip III. But by early September, new afflictions added to his misery. Chronic diarrhea, possibly triggered by gastrointestinal infection, or the consequences of his treatments, further sapped his strength and worsened the foul conditions around him. His kidneys began to fail, causing severe swelling in his legs and abdomen due to fluid retention. This swelling stretched his already fragile skin until it ruptured, creating additional entry points for bacteria and parasites. Court physician Garcia D8 noted that Philip developed a raging fever and bouts of delirium, likely a result of full-blown sepsis overtaking his system. During the few moments of mental clarity that remained, Philip was said to have repeatedly requested a particular crucifix, the same one his father, Emperor Charles V, had held on his deathbed. This powerful symbol of dynastic continuity appeared to bring the ailing monarch some solace, even as his own body fell into complete disarray. Ironically, the medical treatments he received may have only worsened his condition. Adhering to the then-dominant humoral theory, physicians applied harsh compounds to his open sores in an attempt to rebalance his bodily humors. These included preparations containing mercury and arsenic substances that would have seared his already ravaged flesh and likely accelerated tissue death. Bloodletting, performed with alarming frequency, left him further weakened at the very moment when strength was most needed. In his final weeks, Philip's nourishment consisted mostly of thin broths, diluted wine, and soft bread when he had the strength to eat at all. The convergence of systemic infection, parasite overload, loss of blood from outdated medical practices, and chronic malnutrition set the stage for total bodily collapse. His heart, straining under the immense physiological burden, began to flutter with irregular beats. He reported chest palpitations and struggled to catch his breath. Even the elements seemed to turn against him. The summer of 1598 was exceptionally hot in central Spain, and the thick stone walls of the Escorial trapped heat like a furnace, accelerating both the decay of his wounds and the breeding cycle of the insects tormenting him. The sweltering heat hastened the life cycles of the lice and flies that tormented the dying king, while also accelerating the rot spreading through his decaying flesh. The few windows in his chamber remained only slightly ajar, closed enough to contain the foul stench, but too tight to allow in any real breeze. The stagnant air offered no relief to his fevered body, nor could it clear the thick, sickly miasma that hung over his deathbed like a dark veil. By the second week of September, it was evident that the end was near. Though racked with pain, Philip remained mentally aware and summoned his children to receive his parting blessing. His son, the future Philip III, who had been largely shielded from the most horrific aspects of his father's decline, was reportedly shaken to his core by the sight. The prince, confronted by the putrefied, insect-ridden shell that had once been the embodiment of royal authority, was said to have fled the room more than once to gather his composure. In one final act of monarchical resolve, Philip offered his son a grim lesson in mortality. Witnesses recalled him cautioning the prince on the fleeting nature of power, gesturing feebly toward his own ruined form as proof. "I have been treated like an old dog," he is said to have told his heir. "Remember this when the crown rests on your head." Whether this was a warning against arrogance or a bitter reflection on being forsaken by those closest to him remains unclear. On the 13th of September, 1598, Philip called for the last rites. His confessor performed extreme unction, carefully applying sacred oil to the few areas of flesh that did not trigger cries of agony when touched. Observers noted that flies, still swarming, landed freely on the consecrated oil drawn by the stench of decomposition, which even clouds of incense could not conceal. It was a haunting scene, one worthy of the darkest Veneta still life. The sacred ritual of salvation set against the grim spectacle of a king's bodily ruin. His final hours were consumed by escalating respiratory distress, as fluid flooded his lungs, yet another blow in a relentless chain of systemic failures. Each breath became more labored and ragged, every exhale reeking of internal decay. At 5 o'clock in the morning on the 13th of September, after requesting the crucifix be placed on his chest, Philip II of Spain exhaled his last breath. The ruler who had once wielded the riches of the New World and commanded Europe's most formidable armies was undone not by armies or rebels, but by parasites and decay. Preparing his corpse for public display proved nearly impossible. The body, already in an advanced state of decomposition, began to fall apart upon being moved. According to court accounts, the royal embalmers had to act swiftly, dousing the remains with vast quantities of perfumes, spices, and preservation mixtures in a desperate attempt to delay further disfigurement. Despite their efforts, the deterioration continued at an alarming pace. As a result, the funeral rites were drastically shortened. Only the most essential ceremonies were carried out before the sealed coffin was hastily delivered to the royal crypt. Beneath the Escorial monastery, Philip was finally laid to rest beside his father and his several queens, his physical decay concealed at last, though neither forgotten by memory nor erased from historical record. News of the king's horrific passing spread swiftly across Europe, prompting a wide range of reactions. In Protestant England and the rebellious Netherlands, where Philip had long been cast as a ruthless oppressor, accounts of his grisly fate were met with barely veiled delight. Printed pamphlets circulated claiming his dreadful death was divine punishment for the atrocities of the Inquisition and the bloodshed of the Dutch rebellion. Queen Elizabeth I of England, his bitter rival for decades, is said to have remarked upon hearing of his fate, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our shared mortality." In Catholic regions, particularly within Spain, the narrative was starkly different. Official reports downplayed the ghastly elements of Philip's decline, instead highlighting his religious devotion and serenity in the face of death. Court chroniclers omitted the most disturbing aspects, choosing instead to focus on his reception of last rites and his dedication to securing the succession. Spaniards were told that their king had died as he had lived an exemplar of Catholic piety and regal strength. Modern medical historians now believe that Philip's suffering stemmed from a mix of chronic illnesses. His long-term gout likely progressed into a debilitating form of rheumatoid arthritis, weakening his immune defenses, combined with signs suggestive of diabetes such as excessive thirst and pronounced swelling. His body became highly susceptible to infections. The widespread pustules and abscesses were probably caused by a systemic staphylococcal infection, while his immobility resulted in stage 4 bed sores that opened the way for maggot infestations. What makes Philip's case especially striking is not merely the depth of his suffering, but the way his decline subverted the image of absolute power. The king, who had ordered countless men to their deaths on distant battlefields, could not banish the insects feeding on his own skin. The sovereign, whose word had sent heretics to the flames, could not halt the slow consumption of his own flesh by vermin. As the historian William H. Prescott later observed, "No amount of power or wealth could purchase exemption from the physical laws to which all mortality is subject." No, Philip's end is far more than just a macabre episode in the history books. It serves as a haunting memento mori, a visceral reminder that even the highest forms of authority are powerless in the face of human frailty. His death epitomizes the ultimate equality of decay. Kings and commoners alike must endure the humiliation of the body's unraveling. The only distinction lies in the visibility. Philip's rank ensured his torment was thoroughly recorded and never forgotten. Even centuries later, the tragic irony of his fate resonates. He had spent much of his reign waging wars in defense of Catholic orthodoxy and the divine authority of kingship. He portrayed himself as God's chosen vessel on earth, the bulwark against heresy. Yet, in the end, no divine force intervendo miracle preserved his flesh from ruin. Instead of a blessed passing, the most Catholic king met a fate that resembled a sentence forsaken, it seemed, by the very God in whose name he had ruled and waged war. Philip's death signaled more than the end of a monarch. It marked the slow unraveling of the Spanish Empire. His successor, Philip III, lacked both the discipline and administrative talent of his father. Within a generation, Spain began ceding territories and global sway, eventually relinquishing its status as the preeminent power in Europe. Some scholars have speculated that witnessing his father's harrowing demise left a lasting psychological imprint on the younger Philip, dampening his willingness to engage deeply with the demands of governance. Instead, he favored indulgence and delegated authority to court favorites. The Escorial Palace, which Philip II had envisioned as the nerve center of a world-spanning empire and a monument to Spanish might, would never again function as the administrative heart of global rule. Over time, it would assume a role more in line with its austere, designer magnificent sepulchre. Today, visitors walk the chambers where Philip endured his final agony, though the narratives they hear are often softened, emphasizing his religious devotion rather than the visceral horror of his physical decay. Perhaps what lingers most in the legacy of Philip's grim end is its profound impact on how we understand power and mortality. His death starkly illustrates that the gap between supreme authority and utter helplessness is far narrower than we care to admit. The king, who once commanded half the globe, was, in the end, powerless, even over his own flesher warning, still relevant in any age. Despite his many military victories and political conquests, Philip II is most vividly remembered not for what he achieved in life, but for how he exited it, not on the battlefield in triumph, not peacefully surrounded by kin, but through a slow, grotesque descent into decay and torment. His tale is a harsh reminder that the true measure of a ruler may lie not in how they wield power, but in how they endure its inevitable erosion. From the sovereign of the known world to a living banquet for insects, Philip was consumed not after death, like all mortals, but while still breathing, still conscious, still feeling. As we close this bleak account of Philip II's final chapter, we might ponder the haunting phrase, reportedly discovered among his personal writings: "To have been and not to be is not to be at all." For a king so preoccupied with legacy, it is a cruel irony that he is most vividly remembered not for his empire, but for the grotesque collapse of his body. His death has eclipsed his life's accomplishments in the public memory, standing as a raw, unforgettable emblem of the fleeting nature of power, the inevitability of decay, and the brutal equality to which all human sovereign and subject alike here ultimately reduced to dust, inch by agonizing inch.